We will now begin our second plenary session on global governance, the Asian impact on the new economic and financial architecture. The chair is Howard Davies, Director of London School of Economics and Political Science, and the speakers are Mario Monti, the President of Bocconi University, Andrew Sheng, the Chief Advisor of the China Banking Regulatory Commission, and Arvind Panagariya, Jagdish Bhagwati Professor of Indian Political Economy at Columbia University.
And in the hope that we're all mic'd up, we'll begin. We are going to spend the next hour and a half, or an hour and 20 minutes maybe, since you've all been rather indisciplined at the coffee break, sadly, talking about the impact of the growth of Asia on the economic and financial architecture. And we have an absolutely outstanding panel to do that, which I will introduce as we go through. And they're going to talk in alphabetical order, with Mario Monti beginning first. Now, the basic story of Asian growth, both economic growth, trade growth, and also increasingly growth in the financial sectors in Asia, is well understood to everyone in this audience. So I'm not going to go through the numbers. But I think it's also clear that the economic and financial architecture of the global economy has found it difficult to adapt itself quickly to that growth. And you can see that if you look in areas with which I'm personally familiar from my former life as a financial regulator, the Basel Committee, which sets the world's rules for the banking system. 10 of the 13 members of the Basel Committee are from Europe, including Luxembourg, but not including China. And that's just one example among many of the way in which the financial institutions have reacted rather slowly, and I think in ways which are potentially rather difficult, because it's hard to tell countries that they have to obey internationally agreed rules and codes of conduct if they have not been involved in formulating them. It's fair to say this is not a purely Asian issue. It's also true that the rules on banking in Basel were devised and completely finished before anyone thought about how they might be adapted to Islamic banking. And that, again, is an area where the world's economic and financial architecture is, I think, not keeping up with developments in the world's financial markets. But that might take us down a slightly difficult track, although, of course, there are countries in Asia where Islamic banking is becoming significant, notably in Malaysia, which now has the Islamic Financial Services Board. So I hope that we can perhaps deal with that issue, at least in passing. But, of course, it's easy to say that the international financial and economic architecture should change, and more difficult to achieve it. Just last week at the LSE, we had the first lecture from Paul Kennedy, who is in the school for a year this year as a visiting professor, who wrote The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers, and who's recently finished a book called The Parliament of Man about the United Nations. And he gave a very vivid and rather amusing description of the way in which every possible additional member of the Security Council more or less immediately generated a coalition of forces against them. And that has meant that change at the Security Council level has been extremely difficult, and in the sense that problem is paralleled elsewhere in the international financial architecture. Now, just before I introduce Mario, just one, however, slight cautionary note, particularly on the financial side. I was looking at some numbers the other day. In 1987, 88, 20 years ago, 28% of the banking assets of the City of London were held by Japanese banks. And the figure today is between 3 and 4%. So Asian growth in financial markets is not necessarily straight line. We have seen a huge growth, and we have seen a huge retrenchment in the case of Japanese banks. And some of us think that that's a cautionary tale that the huge Chinese banks now need to reflect on as they consider their international strategies. But nonetheless, whatever they do, they are going to be major players on the world's financial scene for some time to come. Now, we have three presentations, which I can tell you, since I have talked to the three participants, are going to be complementary. And Mario Monti is going to begin, and particularly to focus on the way in which European developments can offer lessons from Asia. Mario and I our careers have circled each other from some time. He was the commissioner responsible for the single financial market when I was at the FSA, so he used to give me instructions, which, as a good Brit, I completely ignored. He's now, of course...
I wasn't aware.
He's now, of course, a fellow university leader at Bocconi. We sit on an advisory board together, and I have always found him a fascinating and stimulating person to listen to, as I'm sure you will. Mario.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'm delighted to be here, and I'm very grateful to GPPN and Dean Mahbubani in particular for inviting me. Well, I would like to build my short remarks this morning on two quotes from the first session. Our chairman of the present session hadn't arrived yet, so as you can see, I try to escape from his vigilance and supervision. The first sentence was by Dean Mahbubani, Asianization of globalization. And he's entirely right, I believe. Asia is the key driver of globalization going forward, economically, financially, and not only. The second sentence I wish to pick up is from Minister George Eo, who asked, what is Europe's role? Mainly for Europe to decide, he answered. And he expressed a demand for European involvement, for a bigger European involvement, and a regret that, in a sense, the supply is not there to the required extent, the EU being so concentrated on its own internal integration and relationships with the US and Russia, for example. Now, my statement would be, to put it bluntly, globalization is exploding, is growing exponentially by Asianizing. But globalization is going to implode unless it gets somewhat Europeanized. My starting point is that globalization, unlike a commonly held view, is not an irreversible phenomenon. Globalization was there already in the past, to an extent maybe higher and more intense than it is observable today. Research by Jeffrey Frieden of Harvard and others show that in 1914, many indicators of the globalization of the world economy were higher than they are today. Yet, there was the collapse of globalization with World War I, and the attempts to reconstitute some world order in the 20s were there, but failed. Now, today, technology, which of course was a key driver of globalization, is probably irreversible. But we see a growing set of signals concerning protectionism, closure, non-acceptance of immigrants, economic nationalism, willingness not to accept foreign acquisitions of key domestic assets, more or less everywhere in the world. That is, we are seeing a number of manifestations of a powerful backlash against globalization. To keep globalization going, I think we need to make it more sustainable, more acceptable, including more acceptable as to its impact on the distribution of income, including within old industrial economies. In other words, we need more governance of globalization unless we are ready to see globalization collapse, though Asianized. Now, here the Europeanization comes into the picture, not in the sense of Europe taking itself the lead in the process, but in the sense that I believe strongly some elements of the EU model are probably the best available software for the governance of globalization. I would point here to two key ingredients. One is the integration of markets by dismantling barriers, and the other element is the coordination of some aspects of public policies, including some elements to enhance cohesion, as Europe did since the beginning through regional policies and structural funds. Globalization at a continental level, but still a huge exercise of globalization, has happened in Europe in the last 50 years because of the integration of markets and the dismantling of barriers, and it has been altogether accepted because it was accompanied by this coordination of some elements of public policy, which does not mean necessarily and in all areas single public policies. Now, can Europe take on a more active role, both in engaging, say, with ASEAN and in helping the global community adopt somewhat similar principles of governance at the global level, thus helping globalization to proceed rather than to implode? My answer is moderately positive. Yes, I think Europe can take on a more active role for two reasons. One, it is often neglected that the EU is only now coming out of a 15 years long dark tunnel, in the course of which the EU did something that no country ever did in such a short span of time. It put together a single market, a single currency, and enlargement from 12 member states to 27 member states. None of these achievements is perfect. All of them, though, are in place. No country in the past ever did so quickly one of these, let alone the three of them together. I find it remarkably unsurprising that a set of countries which had to go through this tunnel were not particularly strong performers in terms of economic growth as this dark navigation proceeded. But now that is largely over. And my second reason for moderate optimism is that since last Friday, the European Union has a new treaty, not a grandiose constitution, but a more functional, down-to-earth, effective set of rules. To give you just an indication, more subjects shift from the paralyzing realm of the unanimity rule to the area where qualified majority is sufficient. There will be an end to the ridiculous 6-monthly rotation of presidencies of the Council. There will be in place a president of the European Union for 2.5 years, and for 5 years in a row, there will be somebody who has almost the powers of a foreign minister of the EU, even though, for due deference to one important insular member state of the EU, that figure is not being called Minister for Foreign Affairs of the EU. So, in a sense, this is a typically British understatement of a function of a function which nevertheless resembles somewhat to this foreign minister. Now, my chairman and neighbor on the left, Howard, would be ready to point, I'm sure, that the treaty is not yet there firmly on the ground, ratification will be needed, etc., etc. And I agree with him in advance in that respect. But still, the treaty is there, in a sense. Now, Gradually, this will bring to a more common EU foreign policy, the effectiveness that will extend to the EU foreign policy gradually, the effectiveness that derives from speaking and acting as one. So far, as many of you will know, there are only 3 areas where the EU can speak and act as one. These are trade policy, monetary policy, and competition policy, the field I know best because I was in charge of it for 5 years. And there, in particular in competition policy, decisions are taken in Brussels for the whole of the EU. Actually, you might remember that Dr. Kissinger complained about the lack of a telephone number to call in Europe. Now, of course, he was totally right, but in the more modest area of competition policy, it has been the case since a long time that there is one telephone number in Brussels, the Commissioner for Competition, and actually 2 telephone numbers in Washington, the Justice Department and the Federal Trade Commission, not always totally homogeneous with each other. Because Europe is able in this area to act and speak as one, there is a very strong and satisfactory bilateral cooperation between Washington and Brussels in antitrust. There is soft convergence in most cases, not necessarily on each single case. Some press has been devoted recently to the Microsoft case, which was a rare case of divergence. But there the EU ruled. Its decision of 2004 has been recently upheld by the European Court of Justice. The US has accepted that this is an entirely legitimate phenomenon. And by the way, the competition authorities of South Korea and Japan have been going down a very similar path in their own Microsoft cases. And in 2002, at a moment of huge transatlantic tensions about Iraq, where nothing was moving in the sense of progress between the US and the EU, in this area of competition policy, despite some occasional disagreements, it was possible, and Alan Fels is here, he was part to that enterprise, to launch the ICN, the International Competition Network, which now gathers more than 90 competition agencies from around the world. I think, Anne-Marie, exactly the kind of network among government agencies you were suggesting. Now, my hope is that through the new treaty, ratification permitting, there will be a gradual, timid extension to the area of foreign policy of this effectiveness through unity of word and deed that hopefully can, in the future, allow Minister George Yeo to say, yes, we had a greater demand for EU involvement in our part of the world, and after all, those guys have been able to supply that greater presence as we had wished. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, I won't accept Maria's challenge to get into a lengthy debate about ratification, but I will just say, on Saturday morning, as I got on the Eurostar from London to Paris to go to the Rugby World Cup final, I found myself, completely by chance, sitting just in 2 seats next to and hemmed in by the editor of the Daily Telegraph. Obviously, I tried to escape, but I failed. And I said he was a very happy man, because he had a new purpose in life. And his new purpose, following the Lisbon Agreement, was to get Brown to have a referendum. And the Telegraph and the Sun and the Mail are going to campaign determinedly for that from now on. So this is Gordon Brown's worst nightmare, and made even worse by Nicolas Sarkozy, who had dinner with Tony Blair on Wednesday and has spoken positively about him as a potential president. Now, if you were Gordon Brown, can you imagine anything worse than that? So you are counting your chickens, I think. But never mind. Let's move on, because we are in Asia and not on the Eurostar. And we're going to have next contribution from Arvind Panagariya from Colombia, who is the Jagdish Bhagwati chair. Whether holding that title means that you have to be a Bhagwatian, I don't know, but we'll perhaps discover that. He was chief economist of the Asia Development Bank for a period and has just finished a book called India, the Emerging Giant, which will be published early next year. But he's going to talk to us about the international financial institutions and what needs to happen to them.
Thank you, Howard. I also want to join Mario in thanking the school here, Dean Mahbubani, for inviting me. It's a great pleasure and privilege to be here. I also want to actually begin with one of the quotations that Kishore actually started off with, the Asianization of globalization. And I want to echo Anne-Marie Slaughter a bit first that, there is clearly, in terms of this movement of Asianization of globalization, there have to be these networks that have to be at work. And in the long run, evidently, this is going to churn through. And at many different levels. I mean, I see in the U.S., a different kind of Asianization going on, which is that, the increasing visibility of the Asians, certainly in the United States and perhaps Europe as well, in a variety of different forms. Nevertheless, I think, if there is going to be an impact in the short to medium run in terms of Asia ultimately being at the center stage of the global economy, it is important how the institutions, the economic and financial institutions themselves are run. Are they really right? Are they accommodative of these kinds of major changes that have actually taken place on the economic side, which is, in one sentence, the enormous increase of the enormous increase in the weight of Asia in the global levels of incomes. What I want to do really is talk briefly about three particular institutions. So I'm going to be very focused in this respect. One is the economic institution, which is relating to the global flow of international trade, that is the World Trade Organization, the WTO. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the architecture of the two major financial institutions, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. There's good news and bad news, I think, on where my own comparative advantage is, which is international trade and the WTO. News is generally good. I think my own view is that this institution, at least in terms of its structure and its ability to actually flexibly accommodate the economic changes that happen out there, is quite remarkable, actually. And part of it may very well be because this is clearly the youngest of the institutions we have. The WTO, after all, came into existence only in 1995, even though its predecessor, the GATT, had existed. But nevertheless, WTO, in a sense, while GATT is a part of the WTO itself is a somewhat of a different institution. I think this is a relatively well-run, one member, one vote institution. So in this respect, I think there is equality. Developing countries do enter slightly differently, but that's only in the sense of if there is any special and differential treatment to be accorded to the developing countries. But in other ways, there is general equality. But in terms of the two major functions of the WTO, we got there are others, but two major ones is what I would like to mention and explain how I think the institution does kind of have a structure that is conducive to the accommodations that are required as the economic weights shift around. One is the implementation of the existing agreements. So you got GATT and the Trade and Services Agreement and the Intellectual Property Rights Agreement and so forth. So as far as the implementation of the agreements is concerned, clearly the WTO is an institution which treats its members equally, and we got a large number of cases where developing countries, including smaller developing countries, have actually successfully challenged the larger developed countries. The latest couple of cases we have had were by Brazil against the United States on cotton subsidies, and then against the European Union on sugar subsidies or sugar quotas. In both of those cases, Brazil actually won. So, as far as the implementation itself is concerned, it is a relatively equal kind of institution. The developing countries, including those in Asia, can certainly work with it. On the negotiation, obviously, large players actually have greater negotiating power, and they count for more, undoubtedly, because this is ultimately a negotiation. Nevertheless, the way I think the system has worked, it is quite remarkable how within 10 years, actually, you see the power shifting in these negotiations. 10 or 12 years ago, you had the so-called old Quad, which was the United States, European Union, Japan, and Canada, which typically led the negotiations. Once they agreed among themselves, the agreements happened. But today, we got a changed world. What we have is what I like to call the new Quad, which is the United States, European Union, Brazil, and India. So the developing countries are very much centrally there. Negotiations really cannot really move forward unless the developing countries actually are on board. And China obviously is there. China has chosen to kind of sit back actually as a part of the G20. This is the different G20 than the G20 that we mentioned before in the morning session, so it's this G20, which is the developing country grouping that is representing the larger developing countries in the negotiations, and China is very much a member of it as well. And certainly, today, the character of these negotiations has changed enough, actually, that when the last meeting happened at Potsdam, and the USTR, Susan Schwab, actually began to point finger at both the Brazilians and Indians. These were the trade ministers' meetings, and for not making enough concessions, without actually having made her own concessions. The two trade ministers could really stand up against that, and in the end, were in a position that at least one of the two ministers actually even walked out. So this is an institution where actually the countries are able to exercise their economic weight and power, and so from that perspective, I think the institution is working reasonably well. On the margins, we can come back in the discussion. Improvements could be made. The two challenges on the trade side that I see coming are clearly from bilaterals, the PTAs, preferential trade agreements, which are dividing the trading system, fragmenting it in a major way. And here, since Howard talked about whether the Bhagwati professor has to agree with Bhagwati, he does actually on this issue, that there is a spaghetti bowl of tariffs now in existence, with rules of origin, different transitions of the various FTAs. Tariffs very much depend on, from which country the product came, what stage of implementation is the FTA, what rule of origin applies, and so forth. The other, I think, big challenge for Asia really that is out there is the rising protectionism in the United States, but generally in the rich countries, in Europe as well. And that is something that, again, Asia really needs to think out and react to in a serious, substantive way. Ultimately, seems to me that, solution, at least the short-term solution to both of those, the rise of bilateralism and the rising protectionism, at least rising protectionist sentiment, if you look at all the Democratic candidates particularly, every one of them is actually out there trying to display their credentials as protectionists, really, not rather than as free traders. And Hillary Clinton who is the front runner, actually has gone on to even say that, every 5 years we should review all these trade agreements that we have, and if they are not serving the interests of the United States, we have to change them. So it's, quite a very strong statement and position out there. Ultimately, therefore, I think what Asia's interest really is to push the Doha round through much more aggressively than Asia has done to date. Leave WTO and trade at that. Very briefly on the financial institutions. These are different institutions. These are not like the WTO, IMF, and the World Bank. Basically has a very clear distinction of membership based on whether you are a developed country or a developing country, part 1 versus part 2. And these are both institutions that are actually dominated by the part 1, that is the developed countries. And US has a veto on all the major decisions. European Union, if you put together the membership, they have a veto as well. developing countries have very little kind of voting power in these institutions, and that is clearly an unequal relationship. China, which is now has a very large economic weight in the global economy, nevertheless has votes in the International Monetary Fund that are less than Belgium and the Netherlands taken together. I mean, that tells you that China is the largest developing country here. Nevertheless, its voting power in the International Monetary Fund remains very low. If IMF is to be an effective custodian of the financial system, clearly, something needs to be done. The debate has been out there. Two interrelated reforms that it really requires is that the capital base of IMF is really not sufficient actually to deal with the financial crises that happen, and so capital infusion is required. But that capital infusion can, of course, also be actually coupled with the shift in the voting powers. If the quotas are redistributed, the additional quotas, that is, are distributed more in favor of the developing countries. I don't see that's really going to happen, either of those, major infusion or big change in the balance of the votes in the IMF, and therefore there is a question out there. I mean, here is the bad news. I take pessimistic view. Countries effectively are therefore finding their own solutions, meaning everybody is accumulating reserves to self-insure essentially against these crises. It's tied into the exchange rate issue as well, but certainly accumulation of reserves to self-insure is an important part of that story. Some regional initiatives in the form of like Chiang Mai initiative, which was mentioned earlier in the morning session, have happened, but I really don't think that these are likely to emerge as alternatives. And certainly I believe in having multilateral global institutions rather than regional ones. So neither that's very likely nor is it perhaps desirable. But that really leaves the system in the lurch. That in effect, that marginalizes the International Monetary Fund. I know in India, for instance, the International Monetary Fund maintains an office, but I don't think anybody is ever consulting the IMF staff in New Delhi. World Bank, finally, I want to be more radical. I think Kishore Bhagwati told us to be provocative, so here it is. I think this is an institution which is gigantic. It's very large, 10,000 employees plus several thousand consultants. That compares with only a few hundred employees for the World Trade Organization, less than 3,000 employees for the International Monetary Fund. And frankly, I'm not quite clear what these employees really are doing. I mean, 10,000 of them, what is the bank doing? To a large degree, I see that there was a time when it had a focus, that it promoted economic reforms which were intended to target growth. But if you look at the last several years, the whole thing has become extremely diffused. President Wolfenson actually wanted to promote museums and whatnot. Then the focus on corruption, which for ethical and moral reasons we all are against corruption. I would like it to be eliminated, but it is not entirely clear to me that is either a necessary or sufficient condition to get the economy is growing on a sustained basis. India and China have both grown very rapidly in the last decade, and China for longer. I'm not sure that the corruption has actually declined in these economies, meaning that I'm hard-pressed to find examples where corruption was the centerpiece of the development strategy and the countries really took off as a result of that. So, I mean, again, great for ethical, moral reasons, one is against and so forth, but as a developmental institution, should the World Bank not have a more policy-focused, better strategy? That really is the issue. Now, I think the current president wants to go into climate. He also wants to then help the countries bring back whatever wealth has actually gone out of the countries, as the stolen funds and so forth. Again, not quite sure that that's a comparative advantage of the World Bank. And from the viewpoint of the developing countries also, I mean, climate change, if I'm India or China, why do I necessarily want to find out what the World Bank kind of is going to advise me on that? I mean, in a way, it is a Part 1 dominated institution, and there is an issue as to whether ultimately on climate change the World Bank is going to advise me in my interest or Part 1 country interest. I mean, so there is an issue there, and so my take on this is really that, if a reform is to happen of the World Bank, I would considerably downsize it, maybe reduce it to 1,000 employees, give it more focus, and its knowledge side of it actually should be competing like everybody else. In the end, after all, they're the universities who are producing knowledge, and the World Bank is really a follower in these. It's not the leader on most issues, actually. It is able to, because of its resources, actually, articulate some of these things more loudly than the others. But in the end, in terms of the producer, I don't see it as it is the leader. And you got out there the universities, the think tanks, and then you got also the private sector participants such as the McKinsey and KPMG. After all, they are meeting the market test. And if really the World Bank thinks that it has got some good knowledge to disseminate, well, let it meet also the market test. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, plenty of food for debate there, and we now pass to our third panelist. Now, I think of Andrew Sheng as a kind of personification of the story of China in the last 50 years. His family left China to take refuge in British Malaya, which turned out not to be a particularly clever idea. Rather misplaced confidence. But since then, since his childhood and youth in Penang, he's been clawing his way back north to the mothership via Hong Kong, where he cut his teeth, sometimes literally, on the Chinese brokers as the regulator of the Hong Kong stock market, and then more recently as advisor to the Chinese banking regulator, where he and I work together as we're both on the International Advisory Board. Whether there's any further north for Andrew to go, I'm not sure, although he and I did spend a long weekend in Inner Mongolia in July, where he looked particularly fetching on a horse.
Following Howard.
So I think a post at the University of Ho Hot may be your next move, Andrew. But in the meantime, he's going to talk to us about the more financial dimension of the issue this morning. Andrew.
Thank you very much, Howard. It's always a pleasure to follow you. I'm really grateful to Kishore Mahbubani, and the Lee Kuan Yew School for inviting me here today. I speak today as a modest adjunct professor at the University of Malaya and Tsinghua University, Beijing. So I'm wearing, sort of academic hat, and I speak only on my personal views, not with any institutions I'm associated with. Howard and I are both, former securities regulators, and we're very careful what we say. But Kishore has asked me to be provocative, bold, and innovative. So I will take a leaf out of Howard's. I always read Howard's speeches because I really learned, a lot from him. And on the topic of the Asian impact on new economic and financial architecture, the answer in typical Howard's language is not much. And maybe in 30 years, maybe. I think that's the quick sum of it all. To put the numbers in perspective, I think Asia is basically punching below its weight in terms of population. Asia accounts for 55% of the world's population, probably 1/4 to 1/5 to 1/4 of world trade, and maybe 1/4 of world GDP. And in terms of stock market capitalization, although growing somewhat recently, according to MSCI, not more than 15%. Now, everybody's talked today, and I've really learned a lot from the first panel about all the security and the political side of it. But the question really is that Asia is a demographic story. It really is the post-war baby boom, emergence into a post-Bretton Woods world of free trade, liberalization, financial innovation and technology, ICT, particularly ICT technology. And that, demographic endowment to Asia, which has created its growth, is essentially responsible for the so-called global imbalance. And Asia was able to take advantage of that, and people tend to forget this, is that Asia created the global supply chain on the back of American consumption, right? And I think, American, sort of creation of the Bretton Woods architecture, the Asians being the, sort of mimicking of the European mercantilism, if I can put it this way, succeeded in creating the Asian global supply chain. But is that model, in terms of strong export manufacturing with a relatively protected services, agriculture, and financial sector, is really increasingly being challenged. And so, Asia is now in a kind of a middle road, as Dan Roddick said. The most difficult part is not growing out of poverty; it is moving from, poverty to middle income, where the issues, the public policies, are much, much more complex than we understand. And so we need to go back to this old idea of if Asia accounted for roughly 70% of world GDP in 1830, according to Angus Madison, and Asia now is moving back in that direction after dropping as low as 10% somewhere in the first half of this century or last century. Why did Europe overtake Europe, and I think including the West, overtake Asia? And it was really due to demographics, governance, institutions, science and technology. And the real issue in facing Asia is that these same issues are the ones facing Asia today. How do we get the governance, the institutions, to develop the science and technology so that we will not have the tragedy of the commons? Basically, what has happened with these last few years of growth, especially, is that we've reached a stage in which if all Asians consume like Americans, there are no natural resources left in the world. And that is a fundamental problem that we really need to think about. Now, that is a very difficult area in which how we balance. I totally agree with Pratap and Anne-Marie. We've gone market. But we've also realized that market doesn't solve all problems. So Asians being government-dominated suddenly discovered the market, made the right balance, but now trying to find out how the hell do we deal with this. And really the issue now with Asia, which unfortunately we had to go through the Asian crisis to discover this, is that we have a situation of super savers that cannot have enough money to consume. This is the odd thing, that income disparities are now very large. And how do we build the Asian institutions that preserves our state savings rather than destroy it? Because we've seen during the Asian crisis that Asia destroyed something like about $4 to $5 trillion worth of wealth. Because we didn't understand that globalization, punishes you immediately if your policies are inconsistent. And so the environment is changing, and changing very, very rapidly. Now, that changing environment has re-emerged in numbers that are very staggering. The world today, in 1980, the total financial assets was 108% of GDP. Today, it's just under 400% of GDP. There are $48 trillion worth of GDP, of which Asia only accounts for 11% currently in US dollar GDP. The world financial assets is $190 trillion, right? Of which Asia accounts for just 38 trillion, of which the bulk of it, in fact, 19.8, is Japan. So half of the financial assets of Asia actually, is in Japan. But the leverage ratio of Asia is about 355%. Other Asia ex-Japan is 285, whereas the world is, as I said, 400% of GDP. So Asia's sort of financial assets is only 20% of the world. Now, in this world in which financial assets are flowing like the sort of big waves that can be tsunamis, what has happened with that Bretton Woods architecture? If you add up the three balance sheets of the Bretton Woods institutions, in which IMF, World Bank, and the BIS, which I include, you get $950 billion. You know, as Minister George Yeo said, billions these days is small beer. And the last time I heard it was small beer was in 1996. You remember what happened after that. That small beer is $950 billion, is a big number by any standards, is only 0.5% of total global financial assets. And is less than, you know, the reserves of China today. Now that, you know, sort of goes to show some of the difficulties of trying to manage global architecture through the Bretton Woods institutions. And the reason for this, I think Minister Surin put his finger on it, was the Asian crisis. When Asia, who thought we were the best friends of the dollar, friends of the institutions, needed the Bretton Woods institutions, you know, that lender of last resort function was not readily available. I'm saying it takes time to get it. And the result is, thereafter, every Asian country swore not to get back into that situation again and started building very, very large reserves. And that large reserves is partly, as I said, partly, you know, demographic. So I think, you know, the reform of the architecture sooner or later needs to come. Arvind has put it in very good sense. But I don't think that, you know, we need to dwell on that. We can discuss that further. But what are the issues for Asian participation in global financial architecture? I think we need to have more dialogue. The trouble, I think, you know, and I'm speaking, you know, my own personal view of this, is that Asia is struggling with what is Asia. I mean, I think Pratap puts it right on. You know, the body has changed, but the mindset has not quite changed in this sense. You know, there is insufficient within Asia domestic analysis, not enough think tanks, not enough to think through, because everybody's focused on domestic issues, and foreign policy, as we all know, that's what I learned. Foreign policy is domestic policy spoken for the foreigners. And you know, the domestic governance structures is now struggling with how do you deal with the fact that increasingly your enterprises are global, and they're not only just global, but global enterprises are increasingly local. So, you know, the governance structures need to change quite a lot, because by and large, Asian, it tends to be very much top-down in terms of governance, in which the world governance structure is increasingly becoming matrix. I'm talking about business side, but government governance structures have to be much more matrix in form in order to be flexible, innovative, you know, and resilient. And that's a really, you know, fundamental problem that we have. So I feel that is Asia globalizing or is being globalized is exactly the spaghetti bowl story. What do I mean by the spaghetti bowl story, since Mario is here? And it really, to answer the story, we have to ask ourselves, did Marco Polo bring spaghetti from Asia or bring spaghetti to Asia? And the answer is, who cares? Because the real issue is today, what is, you know, spaghetti is very different from Tuscany down to Sicily. It is called ramen somewhere in North Asia. It's called, you know, wonton, you know, or not Chinese ravioli, right? It's called laksa. It's called, you know, mi rebus, or whatever it is. It's all over the place. And as long as we all enjoy globalization, but does not try to say that mine is better than yours, because today, you know, the world is going to be measured in terms of McDonald's, right? It's going to be Mac ramen or Mien spaghetti. That's going to be the global currency. Thank you very much indeed.
Now, I'm going to throw it open to the audience very soon, so I hope you're thinking of your questions and comments. But let me begin by just throwing 3 quick questions back to our panel. And first to Mario. You praised transatlantic cooperation on competition policy. You talked of soft convergence between the US and Europe. Is there going to be transatlantic convergence on how to deal with sovereign wealth funds?
I think that at the G8 a few days ago, for the first time, there was transatlantic convergence in considering that this is an issue, which is, of course, an enormous progress. Even within the European Union, as I know you know, Howard, there isn't convergence yet. And here there is a tricky, without going into technicalities too much, I think there is a tricky issue. Well, the subject is, should a country or a set of countries like the EU think of some monitoring system, if not protective barriers, to assess inward intentions of acquisitions of assets and of companies. Within the EU, it's particularly France and Germany and the European Commission now which are considering this issue. And I believe that there is a tricky issue within the EU. Why? Because the natural reflex, just think of the expression sovereign wealth funds, is that you'd have to apply some special monitoring to flows of funds coming from sovereign entities, from government-held pools of money, which seems to make sense. But that would not be legitimate within the European Union. Why? Because the treaty on which the EU is based has a clear article which says that the European Union is entirely neutral as to public or private ownership of companies. So if the EU has to arrive at a monitoring system which triggers when it's not a private inflow of capital for acquisitions, but it is a public sovereign inflow, then this might be not so consistent with its own domestic fabric of not discriminating between public and private. So that's why many are thinking to the notion of reciprocity, which could not be applied within the European single market, where there are common rules and a common enforcement, but might make sense in a case like this. Very intricate answer, Mr. Chairman, but my mind is fixed on your account of the dinner on Wednesday evening between the French president and the former British Prime Minister, and I think everybody is aware that the reactions to that dinner were quite strong. Within the 24 hours from that dinner, there was an announcement concerning the private life of the President of the French Republic and a large strike in public services in France.
Thank you. Well, if I had a chance for a supplementary, I'd ask you if you could explain to me, as a citizen of London, the practical difference between the Chinese Sovereign Wealth Fund and Electricité de France, which seems to me to be roughly the same idea. But let me ask Arvind, you talked about the new quadrilateral of powers in the WTO, the EU, the US, and Brazil and India. And then you talked about Asia needing to push harder for resolution of the Doha round. But do you mean by that the Chinese are in effect being represented by the Indians, and is that the Chinese think that they are?
I think Chinese themselves have taken a backseat on this, and this may have to do with the fact that bilaterally there is much else going on with the US and China on the exchange rate and so forth. But nevertheless, they are members of the G20. And so in some ways, I would say answer to your question is yes, that the reading I have of the Chinese is that in the end, if an agreement is actually forged, especially with these four major countries agreeing, then China will probably do what everybody else is willing to do. So that's how I read it. I mean, China has undertaken a huge amount of liberalization already as a part of its entry condition to the WTO. So its barriers are, especially on industrial products, are quite far down. And having had the benefit of opening up its markets, demonstrated largely to the citizenry, I think China is in a better position now to open up. So I don't think there is a major obstacle to liberalization from the Chinese side. What I was arguing was that, look, when we talk about this instrumentality, let's say, of the ASEAN, leading or being the fulcrum of these processes, perhaps that's the kind of instrumentality that Asia ought to try to use actually to push forward the Doha round. I mean, in a way, ultimately, remember that both from NAFTA and other US-centered FTAs that have been done, as well as the European Union and its various FTAs that have gone on with North Africa and elsewhere, Eastern Europe, etc. Ultimately, trade is being diverted from Asia. It really is Asian. The way Asia, of course, seems to have reacted is that, okay, so you want to close the markets to us through these bilaterals. We will do our own FTAs, which is one way to react to it. But I think in the ultimate, it'll be better served if the instrumentality of ASEAN or ASEAN plus 3, etc., is used actually to push forward the Doha round.
Thank you. Andrew, when you talked about the international financial architecture, but also about the development of Asia's financial markets as a whole. When you hear Mario talk about the way the European Union has promoted financial development and the single financial market, do you think that, when you hear that, do you think that's offering an interesting and attractive model for Asia, or do you just yawn?
No, I wouldn't dare to yawn. That's for sure. I think Europe offers very useful ideas. And I think the useful ideas of Europe are, is very different. The model in Asia will be quite different from the European path. Partly because the dynamics within Asia are very different from Europe. In Europe, the largest economy within Europe is only 13% of total European GDP. The largest economy within Asia at the moment is half. Okay, and as I said, financial assets of 2/3 of Asia. Now, the other half is growing very fast, but the dynamics are very, very different. First point. Secondly, because of historical reasons, as everybody said, the idea of developing an Asian currency is some distance away. And so we won't be able to have this European option of, first you have a political objective, then you use, a single currency to bind Europe. Asia is nowhere, even near there. And I think the idea also within Asia of harmonizing that word, which I know the British prefer mutual recognition. And I think in Asia, it's much more, we will definitely go the mutual recognition way. I think we have to recognize each other. We have to work within this variable geometry. And it will be pretty messy. But actually, I see some hope in this spaghetti bowl, because I think this spaghetti bowl of bilaterals, because once you actually bilateralize everything, it eventually becomes multilateral. And I see Asia working, in that area, but not in this exactly that follow the European route. The Europeans have given us, in fact, the most successful part of the European integration is this network, because the BIS network of all the European central banks talking informally, in Basel, is much, much more successful in Asia, where surprisingly, a lot of regulators, don't know each other very, very well, and there is no single forum in which they can actually get together and fight it out and argue it out, a lot of the issues that are really necessary within Asia.
Thanks. Now, it's over to you. We have a few minutes left before our lunch. Who would like to catch my eye? Yes, and if I could ask you to use a microphone and give your name and number and institution and all of that. Thanks.
Yes, Barry Desker of the Nanyang Technological University, Singapore. My question arises from Mario Monti's comments. I would ask whether the EU model is really valid for the new era of globalization. And I would make this argument because the EU approach is one of increasing regulation, whereas if you look at the situation from Asia, the model is essentially deregulatory because of the ossified hand of the state, which had prevented growth earlier. The second argument I would make is that if you look at Europe, there is increasing intra-European integration, but Europe's integration with the rest of the world is decreasing. Trans-Pacific flows are now greater than transatlantic or trans-Europe-Asian flows. The larger and perhaps provocative question that I would ask is, if we take a 2 millennia perspective, isn't Europe likely to return to its role as a promontory of Asia? Thank you.
Well, I think that might have been addressed to you, Mario.
That's very challenging. On your first point, Europe as a model of regulation, whereas the name of the game today is deregulation. I think you're partly right, in the sense that much of Europe's single market has indeed been built up through regulation. But when one speaks of regulation, one tends to see the intrusive aspects. But normally, each EU directive has, at the same time, disposed of 12 or 15 or 27 national regulations. And by and large, the big liberalizations in Europe, take the telecom, the aviation, and so on, clearly success stories for the consumer, have been brought from Brussels through liberalization directives. So you can see the regulatory aspect, but it was a regulation to eliminate barriers. At any rate, now there is growing awareness, maybe not yet up to the level of your taste or even my taste in Brussels, that there should be, for the future, less and less regulation and greater attention to the play of the market, and indeed, in some areas, there is a growing devolution to the national authorities. Howard and I mentioned the competition policy. Since 3 years in that area, which traditionally had been captured very much from Brussels, now there is a system of devolution where the national competition authorities play a much larger role in dealing with matters which can be best be dealt at the national or local level. Your second point, increasing intra-EU integration. Well, isn't this, after all, what you would expect from an exercise in regional integration? Actually, some people are now complaining that the rate of increase of intra-EU integration recently is not as great as one would like. I think the crucial point in assessing the EU integration project from Asia, from the US, is the following. Has that created a fortress Europe, as was largely feared in the latter part of the 80s when the single market project was launched, or not? I think by and large, the single market has not created a fortress Europe. One can debate at length about common agricultural policy. I would probably be on the side of the critics, but I would not even dignify that with the qualification of market. On your third question, in 2 millennia, which is a short to medium term perspective, Could Europe be a promontory of Asia? I'm fascinated by the question, and I propose that we give, I think there is one, a Russian the possibility to answer this question.
Thank you. I have another question down the front here. Yeah.
Anne Florini from the Lee Kuan Yew School and the Brookings Institution. I'd like to tie together some comments that Andrew Sheng and Arvind Panagariya made, having to do, Mr. Sheng made a comment that I thought was absolutely crucial, which is there is a question of the sustainability of the economic growth path that Asia is currently on, that Asia cannot follow the Western path because there simply won't be enough in the way of natural resources to make that physically possible for that size of a global population. He also threw out some very large numbers in the trillions of dollars. I'd like to add one more number, which is $20 trillion, which is the amount that the International Energy Agency says has to be invested in new energy systems by the year 2030. There's a very clear and desperate need to figure out how to channel those energy investments in ways that are environmentally and socially as well as economically sustainable, economically functional, which I think is less about new science and technology than it is about changing regulatory and tax systems. And it is certainly not the path we are on at all. We are headed in a very unsustainable direction. And that gets me to the point that Arvind raised about the World Bank. I think this is why Zelik's proposal that the World Bank be focused more on climate change isn't just a question of pandering to the European desire to raise the issue of climate change in every possible scenario. It's because there really is no other actor on the global stage who's in a position to talk with countries about how you channel those energy investments. So the question really is, if not the World Bank, who? Is there any discussion that is happening within Asia now on this question of the long-term sustainability of the development path, particularly with regard to energy, but more broadly as well? Is that discussion even imaginable given the current governance infrastructure across the region? How do we handle this in a governance system?
I think since you've abolished the World Bank, Arvind, I think you have to.
No, well, I mean, you have to let the more balanced kind of alternatives emerge. But if you keep giving this to the World Bank, the alternatives will never emerge. If not the World Bank, who? Well, you have Rajendra Pachuri here, who has just co-chaired the Nobel Prize, heading a network of 3,000 researchers on climate change. There is one alternative. There is McKinsey, there is KPMG, there will be others will come in. Why not? I mean, why do you think that ultimately the authority really lies in the World Bank to do this sort of work? I mean, that's at least how, I mean, in the end, if on every subject, and the World Bank, of course, is very ready to say that, yes, we'll do this. Because every week you could see a report coming in. So the last one I saw on the flight actually was, there was a report on agriculture, and the World Bank says, oh, agriculture has been ignored and we are going to do, which is a good thing. I mean, that's something that the World Bank should not have ignored. It was a part of the World Bank's central mandate actually to bring about reforms in agriculture industry and the rest. So that's the central mandate that the World Bank should follow. But if you really spread it out on everything because there is nobody else, I'm not sure that gives ultimately an outcome that is, from the developing countries' perspective, is necessarily the desirable one. I mean, in the end, what the Treasury says, U.S. Treasury says, matters. It carries weight in the World Bank. There is this clear division in the Part 1 versus Part 2 countries. And I mean, when the World Bank was studying corruption, did it study the corruption in the developed countries, which does exist, by the way? I mean, I live in the U.S. and I see that there. If there is symmetry, then one sees that. But ultimately, this is done in a very asymmetric sort of way. And either the World Bank will have to address those asymmetries. But I really think that the World Bank cannot possibly have comparative advantage in everything out there. And you do need other institutions to take the lead.
A couple more people caught my eye. About 6th row from the back, right in the middle, there, next to the man in the pink shirt.
Min Pham from the United Nations Development Program. My first point is to Arvind on the negotiating capacity gap within UN, within WTO. I would tend to agree with you that yes, we have made lots of progress on narrowing that capacity gap, but certainly Brazil in terms of negotiating stance, would not be a Burkina Faso when it comes to negotiations. Second point for Andrew is that given the size of the accrued foreign reserves that we are seeing in China and in other countries of Asia Pacific, is that a policy overkill in terms of policy insurance? And that there is also, on the other side of the coin, a opportunity cost, because a fraction or some of those reserves could be better used or could be better invested in other areas, for example, a regional infrastructure. Would you suggest a facility using a fraction of those reserves for that purpose? Thank you.
What I'm going to do, because two or three people have caught my eye, is we'll take a few comments and then I'll give you each a chance to wind up. Michael Storper, who is the next one, actually, right along, just the same row. Sorry, go back. Yeah.
I want to raise a kind of I guess I would call it an issue that's sort of collateral to the world financial architecture, and that is that in this discussion there's I think a shared and I would say merited euphoria about the world growth rates that the deepening and widening of financial markets is in part responsible for, and the lifting of hundreds of millions of people out of poverty and development and all the things that we're happy about in the globalization epoch that we're living through. At the same time, it's also a period, like previous rounds of globalization, of some astonishing rises in inequality in the world. And parts of these inequalities are attributable to the usual forces of the winners and losers from technological change, and part of them are because of I think the financial architecture of the world itself. And I just wonder how those of you, because it's not my subject, the financial architecture, I wonder how you think about the possible, let's say, negative political consequences that might be building in certain parts of the world as a result of this. One can think of very strong protectionist pressures in the United States right now, but I think also in other parts of the world, we see it emerging periodically in Europe with the rejection of the Constitution, for example, and in other parts of the world. And the quote-unquote, the losers from the globalization story, I think there's quite a lot of anger out there in various places, and we tend to not want to talk about it very much. So I'd like to know what you all think about whether there's some kind of interface between things that could be done at the level of global financial architecture and possible domestic policy measures that, whether you think are needed or are not needed or whatever, to deal with this other side of the story.
Thanks. Over here, fourth row.
Takatoshi Ito, University of Tokyo. Andrew talked about this currency issue in Asia and said it should be far away in the future. But I was wondering, you and I ran into each other in Washington last Thursday, and we spent so many hours getting here since then. But in Washington, there's a lot of heat on renminbi, and not just Washington, but G7 had a new language in the communique. And, the current account surpluses in China is 12% of GDP and rising, and also foreign reserves are rising, and clearly it's not a sustainable situation. And I have some sympathy to China that resisting the sharp appreciation because of the fear of the exports decline and so on. But since Asia has about 50% close to EU intra-region trade ratio, that it's most natural that Asian currencies would appreciate together. That will lessen the hardship on China. And even if China appreciate 10% against US dollar, if Asia altogether move appreciation by 10%, then for real effective sense, China's hit is 15%. So why not, talk about coordination of the exchange of policies in Asia, which will make the sustainable development in China and Asia possible. Otherwise, I think it's going to be disarray of the currency policies, and next administration in Washington are, I think, more harsh on those trade imbalances and so on. So it'll be, I think, ugly in the U.S. Congress in the near future.
Thank you. I'll take one or two quick ones. Yeah, woman there, and then I'll take you, and then I'll stop. Just over, yeah.
I'm Jennifer Bremer from the American University in Cairo. My question is some ways related to the previous one. Looking at the question of the other side of the reserves is that there is obviously a huge amount of U.S. sovereign debt being held in China, and whether we are in fact beginning to see the first parts of an unwinding of that, and whether that has potentially dangerous implications for the global economy, or if not, I mean, how much of the Asian prosperity that we're seeing is in fact being financed by U.S. debt back to China, which has, I think, both political and economic implications in terms of the devaluation of the U.S. dollar as an alternative to the revaluation of the yuan. But basically, whether that is unsustainable and how dangerous that situation is.
Thank you. Just pass it behind you. That's it. Perfect.
Mehara of Hitotsubashi University of Japan. I just follow up two previous sort of questioners and targeted at Andrew's sort of statement about the enormous increase in the financial asset compared to the real economic activity. One thing which bothers me is these capitals or the accumulated wealth, global wealth, is siphoning back to the U.S., as previous speakers said, to finance the U.S. current account deficit, in my view, at least. And what we are seeing is this globalizing Asia. We have the other problem in terms of the financial sort of structure and system that I also mentioned in the previous session about the U.S. dollar and U.S. asset, U.S. monetary policy. And what we should see is, in my view, is at the same time globalizing Asia, but also globalizing the United States. I mean, in the sense that it's a global imbalance, which is on the both sides, not only the one part is responsible to that imbalance, and we should get together to work together. So if we are just talking about globalizing Asia, it's not really even-handed in a way to share the benefit of globalization, but at the same time the cost of globalization. And that point hasn't been really pointed out clearly. And I don't care whether it's Asia's globalization or globalizing Asia. Globalization is happening, and we should take the maximum benefit out of it. But Asia cannot take the maximum benefit by themselves. We need some cooperation from other countries and other parts of the world. And that thing should be discussed in the same way as we're discussing the globalizing Asia. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, time is going to be against us, so I'll draw a halt from the floor there, and I'll give the three panel members an opportunity to comment. Yeah, Andrew, you've been drawing the heat in most of these questions, so why don't you kick off?
Okay, I think I'm not going to get into this exchange rate issue because I see the global imbalance as I said, a demographic issue, and it's not going to be solved overnight. And the reason why I don't like to comment on the exchange rate issue is that I see, drawing lessons from both Japan and Europe. The exchange rate of the Europe and Japan have been, fluctuated, very widely against the U.S., but the actual, current account deficits have not changed that much. This is one fundamental point, which leads me to think that, current account deficits are actually structural in nature, and therefore demographic. Now, on the demographic issue, there's a complaint that Asia has got a savings glut. I say this is partly due to the Asian crisis, in which, after the Asian crisis, investments completely collapsed, as you know. And so we have an investment, what I call an investment famine, because of the need to follow the policy that you've got to be fiscally responsible, you've got to cut your budget expenditure. And so all this was cut. And then we suddenly woke up one morning and said, wow, the pollution is getting so bad, we need to do something about it. Now, so Anne Florina's question is right. We need to spend it, but you tell me which country has successfully reorganized its civil service to deal with environmental sustainability. The answer is there's no model. There's no real good model, put it this way. And the market can't price this right? So Asia is now faced with this fundamental problem that for the last 50 years, Asia was a price taker in everything. Every product you can think of, Asia is a price taker, right? Asia has not been a price giver. And so how do you deal with this situation when you're suddenly told you've got to be a price giver? And at what price? So if you were to look at this incrementalism, which Douglas North, I believe in, that institutions are path dependent, the whole Asian economy, for all its diversity, needs to deal with the fact that it's paying for higher GDP growth, it is paying a very high environmental and health cost, and its population also beginning to age. How it divides that pie, including the so-called increase in reserves, which we can have another big discussion on. People focus only on the gross number, they don't focus on the net number. Based upon IMF data, the Philip Lane, Milesi, Ferretti, Italian name, statistics on balance sheets, China in 2004 had a net international position of, as I recall correctly, 2% of GDP. So even with the large increase, of its gross assets, deducting the net liabilities on FDI, etc., China's net balance sheet numbers is not out of whack. I mean, and if you think that you need to have some of that cash to deal with the environmental savings, etc., it's better that you do it out of your international savings. And so the role of the dollar at this point of time, that the dollar is still the major basic commercial banker plus investment banker. And the US financial markets play a very important role in recycling global savings. Until Asian financial system gets its act together. And so far, Asian financial system have not shown its ability to recycle its own savings. So, these are big issues that, one needs to step back away from the day-to-day fluctuation of markets to really think through how the hell do we going to mobilize our long-term savings to invest in our children's health, and the sustainable environment, and a sustainable global growth. That's, to me, is a much bigger issue than saying, this is my bilateral deficit, this is your bilateral gain. I think that's the wrong issue to focus on, because we're in the global common now. I think, whether we like it or not, we're in the global common, and therefore we need to all work together, to deal with this, both not just in terms of financial side, but on the overall, sustainability issue. I'm sorry, I'm not talking like a banker or a financier, but I increasingly see this is a cost that we will all have to bear.
Arvind, I don't know if you have things to add, in particular perhaps on the challenge about US protectionism and the risk of if these adjustments don't occur.
Right. Me also, just two questions I'll take which came from the floor, the second one being the one that you just have stated. Negotiating capacity issue was, that is an issue really, and I think, one needs to give the WTO a bit more resources. In the past, what has happened really is that the resources have often gone to the other institutions like the World Bank. Yes. So one needs to work at that. Obviously, a lot of the poor countries don't have the negotiating capacity. What has happened as a result is that the NGOs have come in to fill the gap. That's a double-edged sword. Sometimes the NGOs have given really bad advice, one of them being, that liberalization is bad for you. So as a result of that, the least developed countries got completely convinced that globalization is bad for us, and they decided that they didn't want to liberalize as a part of the Doha round. But point is well taken. On this whole issue that was raised as the winners and losers issue, which of course applies on both sides, the developing country, for all countries. Yet on the developing country side, of course, the overwhelming evidence really is, and I'm very influenced by what I've seen in India in the last 55 years, that globalization has truly done wonders in bringing poverty down. Much more could have happened, but certainly if you look at the period, first 3 decades of India's development, 50s, 60s, and 70s, zero poverty reduction during those 3 decades, completely lost. Very substantial poverty reduction during the last 2 or 3 decades. So overall, I think there's been a huge big plus. Now, there is an issue both on the side of the developed and developing countries, which is to do with the losers. And in the developing countries, obviously, you need to reorient a lot of the subsidies. Again, I know India better, and the subsidies are very regressive in India. That's how I read them. They're quite large, actually, so that if you did proper transfers, you could really do quite a lot, actually, to help out the poor at the bottom 30% of the population. Now, in the US, now, this is where I think there is a bit of a failure of leadership. I'm not sure what one does about that. One part of the solution, of course, is to strengthen some of the social safety nets, strengthen some of the trade adjustment assistance. Obviously, services is a major sector where adjustment is going on. And apparently, the trade adjustment assistance, as it is applied in the United States, applies only to manufacturers. So if you lost your job because manufacturers globalization, that assistance is available. If it's in services, it's not available. And there is also the issue of, at least in the medium term, losses of wages, that wages may decline. There are also proposals out there that, you strengthen those processes that, up to $5,000 or $6,000 per year, you guarantee, when wages decline, you compensate the losers to some degree. You'll never compensate for 100% and not forever, but at least, for some years, you could soften the blow, so to say. Now, where the leadership I think has failed is in failing to really articulate, in what way trade has caused some of this adjustment problem, and in what way it's the technology. And the outsourcing debate to me is the best example of that. I've looked at these numbers. No matter how you cut the numbers, actually, you don't get a very large number of losses of jobs to outsourcing in the United States, 200,000, maybe 300,000 a year, if you want to exaggerate. No matter how you do it, there are a variety of different ways. None of them is perfect, but it's really numbers are relatively small. And remember, when you compare that to the fact that the U.S. economy destroys and generates as many as 45 to 50 million jobs per month, that's a very small number. Nevertheless, if you see, the perceptions are quite different. Perceptions are that really somehow this outsourcing of jobs to Bangalore and Bombay and Manila and so forth is behind a lot of the pressures and pain that's the U.S. workers are facing. The numbers just don't stand out. And then, a lot of the media participation has been, we all, those of you who have ever watched Blue Dobbs on a show, has really fed into that frenzy. But on the other side, the guys on the good side or the right side have not been playing, or they're playing into the hands of the protectionists, and which is where I think, the Democratic candidates in particular have really not done their bit that they should.
Mary, you have the last word.
I would pick up in particular the question on the narrative, the euphoric narrative about globalization. I don't participate in that euphoria. Let me restate my position. I think the globalization is altogether a positive phenomenon, including distributionally, because it has generated hugely positive triggers into the growth process of previously undeveloped countries, but there are huge inequalities within countries. That's why we are witnessing backlashes against globalization, and I said that I do not consider globalization to be an irreversible phenomenon. Can the architecture, the global financial architecture, do a lot to allay these concerns? I believe not. I think it's very important to better design the global financial architecture, but that will not take care of the inequality problems. And the one solution that I think would take care of that is presently totally unrealistic from a political point of view. That is some coordination not in the area of financial architecture, but in the area of taxation. I think that what strikes us most is the fact that governments have declining tax bases, tax revenues, from which to exercise some redistribution of income in order to compensate the temporary losers from globalization. But with the opening up of the markets, it's unavoidable that there is an erosion of the tax bases, and not only that, but a growing advantage for the more mobile tax bases like capital, like skilled labor, and of course the burden is left on low-skilled labor, which is in relative terms taxed more and more. We developed all these issues, but even within the European Union, it has proved massively problematic to arrive at the minimum of tax coordination, which was done, but really at a minimum. I think it would be incredibly difficult to have some tax coordination globally, but at the same time, I believe that if in the medium to long future this is not done, it would be so it's unrealistic to imagine a tax coordination now, but I'm afraid it's unrealistic to imagine that globalization could proceed smoothly without some tax coordination. And that's why, from this point of view, I don't have a solution to offer.
Thank you. Well, we've had some terrific contributions from our three panelists, and I'd like to thank them, Andrew, Mario, Arvind, for a great contribution. I'm not going to attempt to sum up this session, because if I did, I would eat into your eating time. On that subject, however, Kishore has signaled to me that there has been a change following Andrew's remarks, and lunch here has been scrapped, but there'll be buses at the front to take you to the Tanglin Road McDonald's in 5 minutes or so. Thank you to Kishore and the Lee Kuan Yew School for making this session possible. I hope it's been as stimulating for you as it has been for me. Thank you to the panel.
A couple of announcements before we break for lunch. First of all, the next session begins at 2:15. There is one on social protection here in the auditorium. The second one on energy and the environment takes place on the floor above, the 4th floor, at the law seminar room. The next thing is that after the parallel sessions, the buses will take external participants back to their hotels, and buses will leave from the Oitiangham lobby at 4:15. Also, I'd like to remind all participants that the entrance to the Istan is by the shuttle bus. Please note the shuttle buses will be leaving from 3 points only, the school and the 2 hotels. The buses will be leaving from the hotels at 5:30 and leaving from the school at 4:45. Don't forget to bring your invitation card. And now for lunch at the Oitiangham lobby area. Thank you.